How you doing, guys? Today we're going to talk about a Wheelhorse Senior steering box. So before we dive into all of this, let me just preface this whole conversation that's about to happen. I am not an expert know-it-all on senior steering boxes. So quick interjection here, and we'll get back to the video. Keep in mind that this video itself is a little dry. It's really talking about a lot of parts and pieces that have to do with the steering system on a Wheelhorse Senior. Get through the video if you could, please. Thank you for all your support. But I do have a whole steering box column torn apart here on the workbench. And I can tell you what I know about my Senior, how I tore it apart, other Seniors that I've seen, and how I'm going to put mine all back together. So first off, let's go out to the shed and let's see where this steering box is actually mounted on the frame. All right, we have the steering box mounted on the frame, and I'm going to be talking, specifically of 1955 and 1956 Wheelhorse Seniors. Anything prior to 55, I'm not familiar with. It was a little bit of a different design here and there. They changed things, but 55 and 56 are fairly close. The steering box of choice on this tractor was a Ross steering box. It had a single pin worm gear. So in other words, instead of and it was theoretically from a Jeep. That's what I was told, but I don't know about that. But I know specifically for these tractors, there's a worm gear. And then I guess, I don't want to call it the idler arm, my pitman arm, or I forgot what it's called, but there's only one pin in the worm gear, and we'll see that in just a few minutes. But the box itself is attached to the frame by this flange. If the motor and transmission was in place, the transmission is like right there. It's like right almost up to the side of the steering box. The side cover on this steering box is off, and we'll go through that, like I said, in a second. But as you're sitting on the tractor, it's mounted on the left side. I don't want to turn. I was just about to turn, but it's mounted on the left side of the frame. It does go off at a little bit of an angle, so it doesn't come up straight. The steering wheel sort of sits in the center of the hood, but it's a little bit off to the left, and it's not perfectly straight. It's a little bit at an angle, so a little bit of a weird. You know what? I think I have a picture of me on a Senior, and I'll put it up here in one of the corners so you can just see. You can see where the steering wheel kind of comes through, but a little bit of a weird angle that it comes at, but it is what it is. That's what they did. One thing I wanted to show you is this is the opposing support. Now this bolts to the back of the gearbox on the transmission. It goes somewhere right about there. But the interesting thing is Wheelhorse just using an exhaust clamp as the mount for the top of the steering shaft of the steering box itself. So, rude and crude. That's how they did things back then. But I thought that was funny. We'll be digging that out once we get the engine transmission back in. We're going to put the torque tube back together. We'll clean that all up and we'll get that installed. But I just thought I'd show you that visually where the steering box is and how it is bolted in. There's 2 3/16 bolts that go through the flange that bolt into the steering box itself. There's a cap. As you can see, it's all emptied out. So let's go back to the garage and let's take a look at all the parts exploded out on the workbench. Okay, what is all this mess? Essentially, it's all the parts that are required, or most of the parts required to put the steering box and the steering shaft all back together. I got the steering box right here, got it off the frame. I took the cap off, which goes right here. But before we dive into how this all kind of works, let's go over the original parts. Now, this is the original steering shaft tube. This is what's this is what you see. The actual steering shaft rides up the center of the tube. One end of the tube is attached to the cap. There is another cap that goes on the top, and I'll show you that in a second. And then the steering wheel bolts to the top of the shaft. Now, one of the problems with, well, let me take a big step back. This Ross steering box is not the original steering box that was on my tractor when I bought it. The original Ross steering box that was on the tractor was totally destroyed junk. Somebody machined, and you're going to see handiwork here in a second. This is actually off an old Ottawa tractor. It's the exact same steering box that was on the Senior. So this is actually a replacement box, and I'll show you why. This piece right here is the original steering shaft from my Senior. And if you notice, somebody kind of braze welded right here, and this is actually a bearing race. When I took my original steering box apart, there wasn't even a bearing here. And they couldn't use a bearing because they ruined the race. Now there's supposed to be an opposing race on the top, and we'll see that right here in 1 second. You couldn't even have one of those. The other thing too is whoever had it cut the end off of this, again, bearing race, okay, which is supposed to have this clip at the end holding it all together. And we'll get to that in 1 second. But somebody, and you can see the race itself was completely destroyed. The worm gear is completely, you know, I wouldn't say destroyed, but I mean, it's destroyed at both ends, but the actual grooves aren't that bad. So essentially I couldn't use the steering box. Now these are a little bit like hen's teeth. It's hard to find one. So I ended up, unfortunately, getting into a bad deal with somebody. And at the end of the day, I got the steering parts that I needed to put my tractor back together. So I guess it was a good deal. In any event, so the box, the side plate was broken on my thing. There's like a freeze plug at the end. Somebody tore that out and machined the bottom of the, it was, trust me, it was a total disaster. But this box is actually super mint. So I had to find a new steering box, and I had to find a new worm gear. So I was hunting around, bought into the Ottawa, took all the steering box pieces I needed, but I needed to find a worm gear, and I did. I found this particular worm gear. Now, this worm gear was for a John Deere. It's not for, maybe the John Deere had a Ross steering box in it, but in general, this was for a John Deere. I bought it off of eBay, oh my God, 7 years ago. I've tried to find another one, and I just haven't been able to find it. So this is kind of like a one-shot deal, because I am going to have to do a little bit of machining on this in order to get it to work 100%. But in general, it's going to work. Here's the end, here's the clip, here's the bottom race. This goes down in the bottom of the steering box, and we'll show you that in a minute. This right here, okay, this roller, as you can see, they're riding on this portion. There's another bearing with another clip, which this is completely ruined and missing. So this drops into the steering box. These two bearings that you're looking at right now are from the Ottawa tractor, which is the same as the Senior. So I'll show you how this all drops in. There is one small difference here, and we'll show it to you in 1 second. This tube has been cut and hacked. So years ago, I went to McMaster Car, bought a brand new steering tube. So we're all set there. The clamp is going to get reused. Actually, this is off the Ottawa also, but we'll reuse that. This here is from the Ottawa. This is what I meant by, I think I said it earlier, a single pin. There are these Ross steering boxes that have 2 pins. This pin is a little bit worn out, but it fits into the worm gear, as you will see in a second, awesome. So there's no need to do anything really there. And I have the original arm that fits perfectly on this. There's a castle nut for the arm. This is the top of the steering shaft. This is the original steering. The top of this is the original steering shaft from the Senior. And as you can see, we'll get to the steering wheel in 1 second. That's a Scheller steering wheel. So I guess we'll just go to the steering wheel so that way you can understand what I'm talking about. This steering wheel, okay, has a tapered center. Some Scheller wheels are splined, some are tapered. The Wheel Horse Senior had a tapered style steering wheel on. So the top of the Senior steering shaft, as you can see, has a slight taper. There is a Woodruff key, and it's threaded at the top for the acorn nut to hold it all together. There's the Woodruff key right there. So I'm going to, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to reuse this top section because I don't feel like machining all that. I am going to make a new center section, and then we're going to attach that center section to the worm gear itself. So a lot of work going to be done there, but I just thought I'd show you that. Scheller steering wheel. Where's it? All right, right there. It even says Scheller right there. That is the steering wheel that is to be on a Senior. I've been told that they came out of Jeeps. So, and mine is pretty cracked. I'm going to go ahead and fix all these cracks eventually and sand it all down. I'll probably hit it with a semi-flat black just to make it look nice and clean. There are some other additional old parts. This is the cap that goes on the top of the steering tube itself. There's a spring which holds the cap in place. We'll talk about that eventually. There is a bearing that's supposed to be at the top of the tube. My original Senior, somebody made this brass insert, which is actually quite cool, to be honest with you, but we'll talk about that at some point. These are the bushings that go into here that hold this shaft in place. We got new bushings right there. We have a new seal. This is the new upper bearing for the steering shaft tube. We'll go over that. We got a couple shims. These shims here are shims that go right here, so we can set the preload on the bearings, and we'll talk about that in one more second. I know I keep saying that, but I got to put the steering box kind of loosely back together to show you how it all kind of works. So I got all these old parts. I got some new parts. I got some machining that needs to be done, and you know, the steering box itself will be all back together. The ultimate goal is to have no slop. If you ever rode a Senior or driven a Senior, a lot of Seniors, man, they got a lot of slop in the steering. And that goes throughout all my builds. Go through all my builds on the channel. You see, the first thing I always do is fix the steering so it's nice and solid. Ultimately, that is the goal. I'm going to go ahead and loosely affix my steering box back together so that way you can take a look at how all these parts kind of fit into each other. And then we'll discuss what we're actually going to have to do. All right, so we got the steering box here loosely affixed together so I can show you what some of the differences are from the original, okay? Number one, I got the worm gear in. You can see the bearing fits perfectly into the case on that end. Can't really see it on this end, but it does fit real nice. There is a space, and we'll talk about that in 1 second. We do have the arm in, and then if I just turn the worm gear a little bit, it moves perfectly. There is a bunch of play in this, and the reason for that is I don't have the new bushings installed, okay? I took out the old bushings, which are right there. I have the new bushings, which are right here, and I haven't installed those yet, so this arm does bounce around a little bit. In general, as you can see, that's how it all works, and if I take this, there's barely any play. And this isn't even tight. I mean, I don't even have the bushings in yet. And there's barely any play in there. So that little bit of wear that we find on the tip of the arm itself right there, I'm not worried about. I'll just probably just barely touch that with the file just to make sure there's no sharp edges or anything to that effect. The center section of the shaft is nice. It is kind of interesting how the splines are a little bit twisted from over the years of use, but nothing I'm worried about. So we'll just leave that right there for now. And you saw how that went in. One of the things I did want to mention is this. This is a piece that's notorious to being cracked or broken on these raw steering boxes. The one on my Senior was broken. I know of a couple other guys that have torn these things apart, and they're all cracked. And that's partly of two things. One, this bolt, which applies tension to the back side of the arm, they're over tightened, and that will cause, because it's not that thick, it's just light cast iron, right? So they can get cracked real easy. The other thing too is, if you didn't notice, and I should have probably said this earlier, the center of these steering shafts, okay, they're hollow, so water can get down in there, as well as if the top of the tube, if there's nothing to seal it, if this cap is not there, or water is not allowed to get underneath the steering wheel, and what ends up happening, and it happened to mine, is water goes all the way down and eventually starts to fill the steering box up. And, you know, if it's in a cold climate, it freezes and it cracks. And there, in my original box, there was definitely a watermark in it. So it froze and cracked and broke. As you can see, it's rusty, it's junk. So when you install these, from what I've learned, it's just a little bit of pressure just to hold that arm into place so it's not flopping around, and you got good engagement in the center of the worm gear. Now, why is this got a space and not seated fully on the housing itself, which is the way it is supposed to be? The thing of it is this worm gear from the base of or I should say from here, right? Because that's solid. That's this piece right there. That's solid, can't be moved, right? Because that's the race for the bearings. And where the bearings race is right there is a little bit longer or further apart than the original. Now, could I maybe machine it and put some shims and stuff in there to get this down? I could. But what I'm going to do to make my life easy, I'm just going to make a spacer that just mimics the shape of the box and the cap. And then I'll just dial in the preload with these shims. Maybe I'll make it just a little bit thin, and I'll just maybe put a shim or two in there just to set the preload, so that way it doesn't flop around and it turns really nice. So I'm going to machine that and put that in there. That'll keep everything all lined up and happy. I'm able to line up the arm perfectly in the center of the worm gear and get full articulation to either side. Nothing binds. It doesn't hit. It doesn't hit. It all, whoopsies, it all works as it should. So I've already done a loose mock-up on that, but just to let you know that that's what we're going to do to fix that problem. And really at the end of the day, if somebody wants to give me the business because I put a little spacer in there to make it work, so be it, okay? The other thing I'm going to do is I need to machine I'll probably have to bore a hole into the center of the worm gear here and make a slug that slides in. And that way I can center it and line it up with the steering shaft and then weld that into place. So that way I know that the steering shaft and the worm gear and the steering shaft are all in line, as well as do the same for the top section of it. So that way I know that's all aligned and straight. So when you turn the wheel, right, when you turn the wheel, there's going to be no binding. So I'm going to need to work on all that to get that all lined up. The other thing, as I indicated, there's a bearing. Theoretically, this is what I'm going to use. I don't know if this is exactly what I'm going to use, but in theory, that goes up to the top of the steering tube, which holds the top of the steering shaft together. And then this cap goes over the top of everything. Now, this cap is interesting because the cap spins with the steering wheel. So in other words, this is not shoved completely on, okay? This is really weird. It's not shoved completely down onto the thing. It actually rides on this spring. So the spring rides on this upper bearing, it spins, and then the cap rides on top of the spring. Whoopsies. So there's a lot of little parts to this whole system that need to be gone together, okay, to get it to all work. Now, in the next video, we'll start diving down and really starting to put this all together. I think the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make the shim. Either we're going to make the shim for the steering box, or we're going to start machining the worm gear for the steering shaft itself. The tube, from measurements I've taken on other seniors, is 28.5 inches. So basically from the base here to the bottom of the steering wheel is 28.5 inches. Now, I'll probably end up having to do this first, now that I think about it, the spacer, because this is a little bit, this is going to take up the 28.5, right? This is what, maybe a quarter of an inch, let's say, yeah, maybe a quarter of an inch. So instead of doing like 28.5, I'll have to make it 28.25 or something like that. 28 and, an eighth, something to that effect, in order to make sure that the steering wheel falls in the correct place over the above the hood. I know, my God, that was a lot. But if you take a look at all these parts, I'm basically hoping to document everything that's needed in order to put the steering system back together on a Wheelhorse Senior. If you're wondering, those 4 bolts are just to hold the cap on. So we got a lot of work here. That's the reason. This is the last big portion of the Senior before we start putting the engine together. All right, guys. I know my content is, I don't have any shticks. I don't do any stupid things. Well, I consider stupid, like let's jump an RJ over a river or something like that. I do documentation and rebuilds so people in the future can use my videos as at least a guide to what needs to be done to save their tractor. So please like, share, and subscribe. I know that this is nothing against the individuals that have subscribed to my channel as of late. Thank you so much. I've had some serious growth. To the people that come to my channel just to either make fun of me or say, what is this idiot doing now? Please subscribe. I'd like to show you some more shenanigans if I could. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for watching. Please come back and see me put this steering box back together. And soon, hopefully, probably in the next 4 weeks, we'll be putting that engine back together. And we'll get this thing up and running, hopefully by spring. All right, guys. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And until we meet again, have a great day.